Good? We up after the break? We're good? Okay. We're going to wake you up. How you doing?
I'm good.
You still wear these same shirts, man, all these years later.
Life is too dull to wear just white shirts.
Yeah.
No offense to the white shirt crowd.
I like the hairstyle. It's working.
Thank you so
It's
much.
working.
Yeah, we got something going on there.
All right. So
Actually, Craig Newmark last night asked me, how often do I have to do this? I think, is Craig still in the room?
yeah.
Okay. Craig, yeah, so he was like, David, how often do you do this? Because I'm kind of pondering. I'm like, Craig, man, just get ahead of the curve. Go for it.
Just go.
Yeah.
Just do it. Okay. So in this book that I'm working on, the first chapter starts with this guy. So a few years ago, you go on a sort of working vacation with Jen and your two daughters.
Right.
You end up somewhere in that journey at an orphanage in Ecuador, and then what the heck happens?
So it was one of these insane flashes of light moment in my life. So I had spent the previous, I won't even tell you my history. I'll just tell you right from there. So we'd spent about a year traveling around the world. So I have two young daughters. At the time, they were in 4th grade and 6th grade. By the way, Jen, my wife, and I were their teachers for that year, which I don't know if you guys have kids, but anyone with kids trying to teach your own children, that's a whole crazy thing. Anyway, we were at this orphanage in Ecuador at the end of this trip. We'd just been to about 18 different countries. And as we're getting ready to leave the orphanage, I look across the way and I see a building with a big padlock on it. So I asked the woman who ran the orphanage, why is that building locked up? And she said, well, you know what? That's our library. And I thought, well, hold on, what's going on? So I asked her, and she said, well, look, here's how it goes. The books take forever to get here. They come on a ship, takes about 6 months. By the time they get here, they're barely interesting to the kids, or they were never going to be interesting to the kids. Right? There was somebody else's Encyclopedia Britannica from 1972 that they didn't want, they wanted to get rid of. And so they kind of used the building almost as sort of their landfill from across the way. So I said, well, that sounds awful. Can we have a look inside? And the woman looked at me and she said, David, I think I have lost the key. And that was my moment. That was my moment. That is where I looked back across my life and I said, wait, I was the kid who literally would read as I walked to school. People would call my mom and say, David's going to get run over someday because he's going to get, he's not looking. I was a comparative literature major. I left Microsoft. I'll tell you this story another time, but I left Microsoft, when Bill Gates was staring me in the face saying, you mean to tell me you're going to go work for some tiny little internet bookstore that nobody's ever heard of? That has got to be the stupidest decision I've ever heard anyone make.
That's his favorite quote.
It's a classic Bill Gates thing. But the thing is that I looked through my life and I saw books over and over again and technology over and over again. And I said, look, this is one of these things where it's sort of why I'm on this planet. We've got to solve this problem of 1 billion people with no books or with the library locked up. And the rest is where we are today.
So most people look at that and say, okay, maybe I could, get them a new library. I could help them get some better books, but you've got this different lens on this thing.
Right.
You have this sort of thing going on inside your head. So I don't know. You could have just done a few nice things. You went all in. Like, what's the deal? Where'd it go from there?
So I sort of think everything in life is this kind of friction between the romantic and the practical. The romantic in me is I've loved books, forever, and it's not just that. I mean, reading matters in a very, very deep way. Actually, I have many statistics on this topic, and I've learned a lot about the topic in the last 5 years. One of them, of course, is if you're born to a mother, a literate mother, you have a 50% greater chance by the age of 5 of still being alive, right? So books matter. Another way to sort of frame this thing is there's a company in the United States that builds prisons. And the way they decide how big to build their prisons is they look at the literacy rate in the community. The lower the literacy rate, the bigger the prison. So there are all sorts of very rational reasons why if the world had more books in it and if people were more literate, the world would be a better place. That's the sort of the one side of it. But the other truth is I'd worked at Amazon for many years. I hired a lot of the guys on the Kindle team. I worked at Microsoft for many years. I love technology ever since I was in 8th grade. I would go to the Radio Shack and play around with the computers there, the TRS-80s. So I just sort of figured, look, you've got this sort of really good reason to do something, plus you've got some skills to get it done. Let's figure out a way to use digital books, right? Because the world's going digital. Let's figure out a way to get digital books in the hands of 1 billion people.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'll give you I have a couple of pictures which sort of paint the story. The organization is called Worldreader. It's about 5 years old now. And as I say, there are about 1 billion people on the planet who don't have any books in their lives. In fact, A nice way to visualize that is this picture right here. This is a woman, this is a picture I took at a library in Ghana, which is where we do a lot of our work now in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a wonderful building. It's got beautiful light, it's got a nice table. But as you can see, it's missing something very important. There are 1 billion girls in exactly this situation. This doesn't make any sense at all. So the insight that we had is, look, as the world goes digital, a couple things happen. First of all, Moore's law works, right? Cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Every 18 months, it gets half as expensive. Number 2, cell phones are everywhere, and the world is getting more connected. So let's figure out a way to use this as a way to get digital books to everyone. So I'll just give you a couple of real quick pictures of one of our earliest projects, again in Ghana. This is literally the dirt poor village where we started our work. You can see there's not a lot going on in this village. It's Ayenya, Ghana. It's about an hour and a half outside of Accra, the capital of Ghana. But we took a bunch of Kindles down there, Kindles that we got from Amazon by doing all sorts of crazy things. We put a bunch of books on them, and we watched the kids start to read. And they would read a book. Here they're reading Curious George. And they would look up afterwards, and they would say, can we have another? And we would download another book. And 90 seconds later, they'd be reading again. And very quickly, we realized this thing was going to work. And so, actually, I'll tell you one more quick story about this classroom. You see some books in the background there. There's a sponsor of this classroom, a wonderful woman named Lisa Smith, who's sponsored orphanages and schools in Ghana. But I will tell you, one of the first books I picked up off the shelf when I walked into that classroom was a book called The History of Utah. And so that's kind of it. So once again, a little bit of the reason I can't not do this is because I can't let kids in Ghana read the history of Utah. That's not going to happen. That is no way going to inspire kids in Ghana to become lifelong readers. Anyway, that was the beginning of it. Here's a quick picture of me I threw in just because I showed you that I used to have some hair, but we're going to move on from there. This is what kids look like when they're reading. These actually are kids reading to their parents. A lot of the parents are not literate, but the kids, of course, are. They're in school. And it's just one thing led to another. And so now we're working in Kenya, we're working in Uganda, we're working in Tanzania, we're working in Rwanda, we're working in Zambia, we're working in Zimbabwe, we're working in South Africa, we're working in Malawi, we're working in Nigeria, we're working in Ethiopia, all with kids on cell phones, which is why the cell phone tower is here. This is Kibera in Kenya, and e-readers. And it's just going to change the world, and that's why I do it. Actually, I got other reasons why I do it, but that's one of the big reasons I do it.
Really quick detour. I still remember from the time you and I had lunch back last fall,
Yeah.
your sense about these kids, like your attitude could be like how needy they are and how hopeless their situation is.
Yeah.
And I couldn't even get those comments out of my mind. And you were talking about how full of potential they were,
Right.
how eager they were. I'm not being corny. Like literally, that was your mindset. Like just because they make you feel that way? Where does that come from?
You know what? When we first started in Ghana, and we didn't know what to expect, and literally we would go there, and the kids would jump up and run towards us, and the curiosity that you could see in their faces and their minds was every bit as exciting as it is when I see it in my own kids. Yeah. Right? And so that's part of it, is you just realize that, oh, that's cool. I did the same thing Ron did. Where's Ron? That was awesome. Yeah, hey man, you taught me how to do that. It's pretty cool. Drop the mic. Anyway, and so look, the other truth of the matter is when and you asked me this question of, some people could have sort of leaned back, and I kind of leaned into this thing, to use that expression. When I was growing up, quick story. So I grew up in Washington, D.C. My mother and dad, this will take about a minute or so. My mother and dad actually met a long ways away. They actually met in Korea. My dad was black, my mom was white. Okay, so I'm, by the way, I'm like a semi-black guy. There are a lot of black guys, I'm like semi-black. Anyway, so my mom and dad meet in Korea. They come back to the United States, and they realize that they can't get married in the state of Maryland in 1964 because it's illegal. So they had to go to New York City to get married. They got married in a friend's apartment in New York City. Their parents did not come. And so and that's kind of how I sort of came into the picture, honestly. That relationship, marriage, lasted for about 6 years. When my mother and dad split, my mother went on to take a job she'd never worked before, sort of professionally. Her first job was that of an encyclopedia salesperson. And she did that to be able to, of course, put food on the table, but also because after you sell 10 encyclopedias, 10 world books, you get a set of your own.
Yeah.
Right? And that was the way I explored the world as a kid. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had the World Book, and that's the way I explored the world. So So there's some combination of seeing curiosity in every single child's face, and then honestly relating it right back to yourself and your own upbringing and thinking, I got to do this.
Yeah. So one of the joys for me of 17 years of doing what I do at SVP is I get to work with people like this guy. And the book title I came up with literally was because a bunch of people say this. So there's not David, somebody else would talk about the work they're doing, whether it's as a philanthropist or a civic leader or somebody like David that goes all in. When they get to this point where they sort of say, I could not imagine not. I had one person literally say to me, it's not that I can do this, Shu, it's that I can't not. So the line I remember from you was, well, once I came up with this idea, how could I not? Right? It just gets so dug in and so ingrained, which is this sort of stickier, deeper feeling. So now you're a little ways into this thing. So I assume it's just been a joyride and easy as heck and pleasant in the last 5 years, just all candy, right?
Just ridiculously easy. I mean, honestly, anyone who wants to start something like this, you just come up and ask me. I'll be like, yeah, this takes nothing at all. Yeah, I mean, like any startup, and Worldreader 5 years ago was a startup. By the way, I should tell you where we are now and then give you a sense of some of the complications on how to get there. So we're 5 years old now. We've got about 50,000 children every single month who read on Kindles in schools and libraries all across sub-Saharan Africa, number one. Number two, we've got about 200,000 kids, actually I've got one more slide like this, who read on cell phones every single month, all around the world. And that was kind of a pivot we made a couple of years in when we realized, hold on, someday there are going to be, in fact, there already are more cell phones on the planet than there are toilets. So let's make sure that the devices we're using are not just devices that we have to source, but also devices people already have. Number two. Number three, we have 15,000 books that we have digitized by working with local African and Indian publishers. Because one of the early insights we had is, people love reading about, Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and the Magic Treehouse series, and they really do. I mean, and we've gotten great support from US publishers, but the truth of the matter is they love reading even more about people who look just like themselves, right? And there's a quote someone said once where books are mirrors and then windows, right? You start out reading a book and you see yourself reflected, and then eventually you read a book and you see it as a sort of window out to the world. And it's very important that that mirror reflect yourself, not somebody halfway around the world, and that the window, of course, be something that maybe you couldn't see yourself. Anyway, back to your question. To get to, we've touched over 2 million people right now. So to get to 2 million people, we work with some of the biggest cell phone companies in the world. We work with some of the biggest hardware guys in the world. Amazon's a big partner. DHL is an incredible partner. Working with very, very large organizations, and we're just a small nonprofit. And we got a $6 million budget, so that's great compared to zero, but it's nothing compared to Amazon, $65 billion now. So making sure that we stay on the radar of some of our partners, very, very, very difficult. Making sure more broadly that we, one more little thing that I've learned about the nonprofit space is that in the for-profit space, I got a thing, I got a cool new, clicker device, and it cost me $5 to make, and I sell it to you for 10. And that margin, that 5, that's what funds my growth, right? And I can do that if I get it right. I can create a flywheel there that creates more and more opportunity and allows me to invest and innovate and create, the awesome, clicker 2.0. Okay, that cycle, which is sort of the beauty of capitalism and Adam Smith's invisible hand, hard at work of, why am I working more clickers? Because someone's paying me for it. Obviously, in the nonprofit world, it's a very different equation. I've got a beneficiary. That person can't necessarily afford what I've got, so I need to give it to him or her, or maybe I can sell it to him or her for less than the true cost to me. And that gap, which now there's still a gap there, but now that gap I got to go fund from somebody else. And keeping that balance between increasing the impact and increasing the funding and making sure that other organizations are still sort of supporting me over the long term. Because look, this is going to take 50 years. So I'm not interested in someone who's just interested in 6 months. I want someone who's for long term. That's a tricky enterprise.
So ups and downs. Is there ever a moment in that 5 years where you felt like, forget it, I'm out, I'm done?
Is there ever a moment where I'm out and done? You know what? It's easier for me to talk about we were talking about this last night. I think I have a little bit of a defect, that it's hard for me to see things that are hard. And so, I remember, crazy, stupid things like, being in a car in Kenya and the driver gets stopped because his taillight is out. And then the policeman tells him to get out of the car, and then the policeman sees that he's wearing flip-flops, which is apparently it's illegal to drive in flip-flops. And so, he gets a ticket and he gets taken to the police, and meanwhile we're getting late for this thing. Like at that moment, there is a bit of like, holy crap, like what have I gotten myself into here, But that's a tiny little thing. That's a tiny little thing. And the highs are, I'll tell you a story about one of the girls in our program. Hold on, actually. I have a little picture here, which if I can get to, it's worth seeing. Oh, hey, that's a high. That's awesome. That's one of our little munchkins in Tanzania. That's a total high. That's actually a picture of my mother reading to me, and that's a picture of my own daughter doing this. But I want to tell you this story real fast, because this is a high. Wait, who was it who just told us the story of high-low, of starting with high-low? Cheryl. Yeah, I thought that was a great tool. So you'll notice I'm skating right by your low to go to a high real fast.
Oh, good.
So this woman right here, a girl at the time, 14-year-old girl, her name is Okanta Kate. Okay, so that's me on the left, this is Colin on my right, my co-founder, and that is Okanta Kate in the center. She's a Ghanaian girl, and at age 14, she says, look, I'm falling in love with reading. I read a book called The Shark in your program, and now I want to be, she is by a Ghanaian author named Peggy Opong, so one of our local books, and she said, I want to be now the most famous writer in the world. That's my goal. So we said, okay, let's see how we can support you. So we did something with her. About a year, we gave her some tools. And about a year later, I came back to her. This is about a year later. You can see she's somewhat more grown up. That's actually my shoulder in this picture, the edge of my shoulder. And she had written some poetry. And this is one of the poems that she wrote. And this was absolute one of the highs, even though the poem itself is quite desperate, actually. In fact, I'll read just a couple of lines. It's called Agony of a Woman. I'm the subject that everyone talks about. I'm a laughingstock everywhere I go. I'm despised by men. Women gossip about me. Children mock me. Barren woman, they call me. They call me a witch. They say I ate my children. They say my womb is blocked. Barren woman, they call me. I live alone in a deserted place. I walk alone with no friends and family. I sleep alone with no man at my side. Barren woman, they call me. So this is rough stuff for a 15-year-old. And we said, it's rough, but honestly, it's wonderful. And she's a wonderful, wonderful woman, or sort of girl now woman. So we said, would you mind if we use your poetry in our program so that other children could read this? Yeah. And she said, I wouldn't mind at all. So now we look at our dashboard here, and I know you can't read this, but there are books on, the Angel of Mexico City and The Vial, and a book about Lionel Messi. But if you look real carefully down, she's the number 20th most read author in our program right now. This is people reading on cell phones. And oh, by the way, this is what she looks like now, right? She's now a 17-year-old, and she now volunteers in our program after school. So whatever tiny little lows happen, some publisher that flakes out on you, or some, Penguin Random House, those guys are awesome, but oh my God, what a pain in the butt to work with sometimes to get their stuff into our program reliably and not have their lawyers slow it all down and so forth. But those are details. The big thing is watching Okanta Kate become who she's going to be and unlocking her potential. It more than makes up for it.
So there's, in the folks like this guy that I've worked with, there's sort of three characteristics that really, really stand out to me. One of them is this sense that somebody like David, is a determined optimist. And I don't think David would be a determined optimist about lots of other things in the world, an environmental challenge or something else, right? This happens to be the thing you're a determined optimist about. Yeah. And he's obviously an optimist. He's got to be determined. It goes along with, you've got to be both, right? You have to have this optimism that's grounded in reality, and you have to be determined, believing that it is possible, right? Yeah. So one of the things Dent tries to do, I think, is not just tell you the story, but also leave you with some of the lessons of folks like David. So that, for me, is when you think about what the dent is you want to make in the world, be thinking about that thing that you are determined about and you are optimistic about, and both of those things together. And then just one more quick thing. When you listen to David's story, part of where that comes from is sort of like core to who you are.
That's right.
Like when you were growing up and you were reading those books walking along, and the story about your mom and where you grew up, right? So that what his optimism is, it's also connected to something that's core to who he is, right, which means you're just going to stay with it that much longer, and it's going to feel that much more natural to be a part of it.
That's exactly right. And you need that. You've got, this is, as again, I think Cheryl was talking about. First of all, working in the world of global illiteracy and trying to get books in the hands of 1 billion people ultimately, not alone, by the way, actually, kind of going back to what Ron was saying, we're not going to be the only people who do that. This is a project much, much bigger than we are. But still, you've got to have a very long-term view, which means you better have, some form of, as you say, deep, we think of it inside as conviction.
Yeah.
Deep conviction that what you're doing matters. There better be some evidence there, otherwise you're just sort of a whack job. But if you've got real conviction there, that for example reading matters and that there's real, as I say, evidence to back it up, that can become your sort of North Star, right? That's the thing that you look at every morning when you wake up. I'm lucky, I jump out of bed at 6 in the morning and literally run to work because I'm so excited about this. But I know it's a long-term thing, number one. Then number two, I'd say you have to marry that, and again this gets back to this idea of the romantic and the practical. You've got to marry that with something you're probably pretty good at. Yeah. And I've been lucky. I mean, I worked at Microsoft for years, building technical products that reached millions of people. I worked at Amazon when it was a tiny little internet bookstore, and we grew it to $4 billion by the time we left. You learn some things there, and those are very practical things. So if you're just a sort of, if you're only optimistic, that might not be enough. You also probably better be good at something, maybe even very good at it. But if you can find something that's at the intersection of those two things, then you can do something pretty amazing that can last for a long, long time.
And what I love about what you did and what I want people to do in the world that want to make that change in the world is to be just as intentional about that as you are about your career. So it isn't just like I went to this thing and I liked it and it was fun. Maybe you'll fall into something, but there's this conscious choice that he made that was sort of like thinking about a career, right? It's an intentional set of choices about what he believes in.
Although I'd say you have to be a little open to serendipity too.
Oh, hell yes.
You sort of do your inventory and you think, what do I want to do next? And then to a certain extent, you kind of have to let some things bounce off of you. And you say, that sounds great, but that's not me, even though it sounds incredibly interesting. I mean, we were having dinner last night, and where is Renee? Renee's over there. Renee was telling me about a friend of hers who is super deeply passionate about EMF, right? Electromagnetic forces, is that, or fields, something like this. I don't know anything about this. It sounds incredibly important. It's about how cell phones are going to give us brain tumors and other things. It doesn't happen to be even though I can see it's important, it doesn't happen to be the thing that gets me, as motivated. But so some other ideas are going to bump into you that if you're a little bit too quick to move, you might jump onto that and say, that's my thing. Nah, wait till it's really your thing, and then go.
It's a journey, no question. So you said to me, reading is our vaccine against poverty. Reading is our vaccine against poverty. So where do you go from here with this work? That's not a short term. That's not a short term statement.
It's not. Here's, how do I think about that? And this I'm a veer to something just a little bit different. But if you sort of look at some of the big global problems we have, let's focus on just one, bless you, for a second, which is the rising inequity between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. And you think, okay, well that matters because that's the sort of thing which ultimately can bring down societies, it brings down countries, right, when revolutions happen, and ultimately can be very, very destructive. Okay, well, then you have to say, well, what's the root cause of that? And of course, a lack of education is one of the most fundamental root cause problems to poverty. And again, a tremendous amount of research here. By the way, the other almost more optimistic way to think about this is if you can get, trickle-down economics, that theory has sort of been long debunked. So, okay, let's set trickle-down aside and let's do something different, which is sort of this middle-out idea. That there's an enormous group of people in the middle whose potential is waiting to be unlocked. The next billion people who are going to be our next billion consumers and our next billion creators. That is, the world, in 20, 30, 40 years. By the way, that is not a world which is halfway around the world from us. That is the world that is right at our doorstep. And so, to a certain extent, we sort of draw a line between, putting books in people's hands, which creates a literacy movement, which unlocks the potential of billions of people, which then really helps our planet in a very, very big way. And I know it sounds a little grandiose, and this is sort of always the danger here, is you can start to sound a little insane. But we not only have conviction about it. The good news again is there's a lot of evidence to say that you get people educated and they become more productive and lift themselves and ultimately their countries out of poverty.
Somebody's got a dream, right? How about a couple questions quick? For David or for me or for anything that's on your mind. Yes, ma'am.
So there are a lot of, I guess, infrastructure barriers, for lack of a maybe a better term, I'm not thinking of one, that poverty presents, especially in the developing world for education. Things like access to sanitation, particularly for girls. trauma, right?
Sure.
How do you deal with those barriers? I mean, putting a book in a kid's hands is really important, but how do you deal with these fundamental issues?
Did everybody hear that question? So sort of broadly what she said was, David's working in the context of this broader thing called world poverty, and there's so many systemic challenges out there, sanitation, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you think about the piece of work you do in the context of this broader, really systemic root cause challenge?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I mean, we look at education and literacy within that as, of course, only one part of a much, much broader system. In most of the countries we work in, we work with other partners. We often work in schools, but we work with other partners. Pencils of Promise, for example, which is an organization some of you may know. In fact, we just actually, quick aside, we just loaded up Kindles. This is an e-reader project. We just loaded up Kindles with about 10,000 books for Pencils of Promise. It was so many books, digital books, of course, that we broke Amazon.com's system. This just happened a couple days ago. Anyway, but the point is Pencils of Promise has a very, very holistic view towards education and kind of their place within society. Again, they work primarily in Ghana. But I will tell you that the gap between what we do and some of what other organizations do, isn't always as great as sometimes you sort of think. And I'll give you a specific example. We put Ebola information from the World Health Organization, from the CDC. We had it translated into several languages, and we put it at our cell phone reading app. Within 45 days, 60,000 people had read that information. And so I say that because, again, literacy work, I agree, that's just sort of a very narrow part. It's maybe a very foundational part, but a very narrow part. But of course, once people can read, they can get access to so much more. They can start to, I won't say fix their own problems. That's a little bit too much. But we just think of it as foundational to much of the work that other people do. But you're absolutely right. It's a system, and we're a part of that system.
If I can add just a couple things to what David said. So one is there are other people out here like him that have a different can't not do, to use that phrase, that are working on other parts of the problem. And I mean this in a very hopeful way. We live in this time where, because of technology, globalization, the connectedness, some of the things you've heard all day today, the impact that one person, a group of people, a network of people can have, it's never been greater. So for him to sort of like sit here and say that that's possible, and for you to ask a question like that, for me even sit here and say, actually, I believe that's a challenge that someday is doable. I think in the next generation or two of this world, we are going to solve really big problems. And it's because there's people like him out there doing that, and it's because he lives in a time where the leverage that he can have and the impact he can have as an individual has never been greater. So, yes, ma'am.
So how are you addressing, there are some cultures where girls reading and girls access to education is difficult and at times controversial.
Yeah.
How are you, I'm sure you've come up with that. If you have you, and how has that been?
We have. The question was around, in some cultures where we operate, girls' education is controversial, or worse, and kind of how do we deal with that? We sort of do two things. Number one, when we work in schools, we're very, very intentional and deliberate about our work. We say, we're not here to replace you. We work with the existing teachers. We use existing textbooks. And we let the teachers, of course, choose the books that are going to be on those e-readers. So to a certain extent there, we're trying to reinforce the system, not go around it. Having said that, we also put a lot of information on cell phones, and our sort of, frankly, slightly subversive strategy is to get books right in girls' hands no matter what. And I'll tell you a 30-second anecdote on this. We had a researcher in the UK a couple of months ago study just 20 of our girls who were all reading on cell phones. They were teenage girls in the slums of Nairobi, in Kibera, reading on their cell phones. The biggest surprise for this researcher out of the UK was that 100% of those girls, 100%, had read a book called Male Condom Instruction, which we have in our program. So we have a little bit of a work with the system strategy, and frankly, a little bit of an end-around strategy to get right into people's hands with the information that we think is going to be the most helpful to them.
Can I have a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
What other types of content are you delivering to some of the readers? Are there videos? Is there anything else?
Great question. The question was, what are the types of content? We're very sort of text, book-based. We're very focused on, and it's really largely because the infrastructure. One of the great things about, e-readers like this, and cell phones is everyone's got a cell phone, an e-reader, you charge it for 20 minutes and it lasts for, for a month. But the trade-off is the cell phones are fairly low power. The bandwidth that they have available to them is quite limited, and these don't show video. And so one of the trade-offs we've decided to make is let's stay very, very focused. We're broad in some ways, but we're quite focused on reading and the power of them.
One more question. Yes, sir.
You just made a quote saying that books or reading is the vaccine to poverty.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting because I think it's exactly right. But I wonder if these books are in the right hands. Because knowledge itself is, right, the vaccine to poverty. But what about the people who are making donations? What about the people who are trying to solve these problems? Do they have the right knowledge? Do they realize that not having food makes you much less likely to retain information? Do they realize that not having, so their book donation is useless if the kid doesn't have enough food to sustain the thought? Sure. Do they have the foundational tools to understand how fragmented this problem is? And do you think about that when you go about raising funds or developing new industry?
We do. I'll repeat it briefly. I mean, one of the questions is, okay, do your donors really understand, are they giving money to something that really matters, and then is it having the sort of impact, the biggest impact that it possibly could? One of the really nice things about working in the digital space is we get an enormous amount of feedback back. We can create relationships between donors and their schools. So for example, $10,000 buys effectively a digital library. When we put that in collaboration with the school, we get an enormous amount of data back about the impact it's having, as well as photos, digital photos, and so forth we share back with our donors. So we think one of the real innovations actually in the digital space is allowing philanthropists and donors to have a much better understanding of the impact they're really having. And then they can opt in to do more, or they can step back if they want to. But so far, we're about half donor funded, and people have been very, very satisfied with their experience, in part because they've gotten to see the impact.
So I will leave you with give me 3 thoughts about this guy and thousands of other people like him in this world. I don't think he sat down and he took a quiz, but he did answer for himself 3 questions. What is he a determined optimist about? We've talked about that. I think he understands what he is and what's connected to who he is at his core. And the last piece is I think he knows and he believes he's doing work that he's willing to work through the hard places and work through the hard challenges for. And people that get their arms and their brains and their hearts around those 3 questions are the people that will create change in the world. So he's David Risher, WR. I'm Paul Shue, SVP. We will be around here. If you got questions and we can help you with any more of this, please let us know. Thank you, guys.
That was awesome. Thank you.